Well, greetings and salutations, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well today. Today's upload is, well, puts a smile on my face, and very soon you'll see why. Before we get into it, though, a couple links. As you know, I rely on Patreon, PayPal, and my merch to help the channel to continue to grow and go. The links to Patreon and PayPal are in the description below. My merch is displayed directly under the video. Also, Dogman, Frightening Encounters, Volume 1 through 3, the audiobook versions. They were written and researched by Tom Lyons, narrated and produced by me, Jeffrey Nadolny. Those audiobooks are available on Audible, Amazon, and iTunes, the links to which are also in the description as well. And finally, last but definitely not least, if you'd really like to help support this channel to continue to grow and go, simply subscribe, click the like button, and please leave a comment. It really does help, and it definitely matters. And now, everyone, I have taken far too much of your time. Let's get in with today's upload, shall we? Alright, so the difference in today's upload than any other is one thing. Dogman is not the apex predator in these experiences. Let's get into them. Today's first experience. Hello everyone, my name is Mike. I'm 63 years old, recently retired from a soul-sucking IT analyst job for a major bank in Charlotte, North Carolina, where I was just a cog in the big money machine that facilitated movement of money across the globe. East to west. You can call it dollars, euros, and yen, it's all the same. Money flows like a river. It has currents and eddies, ups and downs, diverted to and fro, damned and damned. You see the trillions of monetary units flowing across the world and wonder if only a small percentage was diverted to help people out. Stamp out war, feed the hungry, healthcare for all who needs it. But that's not the game, and I had to leave it behind. I'm not here to comment on the vagaries of modern society. I'll leave that to the poet, priests, politicians who are paid for their words and lies. So I retired to the country, not off the grid, but close enough to see the edge. Close enough that I can see the footsteps of those who came before, the early pioneers and settlers, the wagon tracks and homesteads of the long-dead chapter in America. A time of exploration, discovery, and a time where one man was deemed only a percentage of what makes up another. By law, a time where cotton and tobacco were currency of the world, and they truly flowed on rivers. My best friend, Galen Chauncey, and I love to explore the remnants of this bygone era before the march of modern society wipes them out forever. Luckily, I live in the largest and least populated county in Virginia. So there are many abandoned homesteads and graveyards from the late 1700s through the Civil War and subsequent migration out of the war-torn South. Galen always has her voice recorder and camera at the ready. I usually man the video camera. She's gotten many EVPs and countless orbs and ghostly manifestations, I guess you could call it that. She truly puts the ghost hunting shows on TV to shame. In our investigations, her number one rule is run if she says run. No questions. A rule I obey maybe 75% of the time. About 10 miles from my house, upon a hill, sits a large mid-1800s mansion, made inaccessible by a lack of a driveway and a tangled thicket of brush and briar. And there's always vultures nesting on the chimney. Talk about spooky. Of course, Galen is itching to investigate. I would always make up an excuse not to go up there. It was too cold, too wet, too damn scary. But where most men would fear to tread, Galen goes, "Come on." And she says it so gleefully, which makes it all the more unnerving. So, giving in to the inevitable, we go out there to investigate. I park my truck below the house, about 50 yards away. It was a beautiful autumn day in the Appalachians. so I could not weasel my way out of it this time, and I had to admit I was curious as to see what was within. With the smell of sassafras and chimney smoke in the air, we started to make our way through the brush and trees. I was struck by all the debris around. I found a rusted-out machete, water bottles, and even an old smashed-up video camera. And shoes, tennis shoes and old moss-covered boots littering the ground. We finally hacked our way up to the front porch. It was magnificent in its decay. The ornate banisters and eaves crafted in a day where craftsmanship ruled and deadlines were an afterthought. The inside was bone dry for the most part. There were many artifacts and clothing from the previous tenants, and more shoes. There was even a TV from the 60s in one of the rooms, which seemed to be the last time the house was occupied. We proceeded to explore the mansion, room to room. We separated, Galen with her voice recorder and camera, me with a video camera. I went out back and found an old well with cement all around it. I looked over the edge down into the well as best as I could. I thought I saw a pair of golden eyes, but it was hard to see, so I adjusted the viewer on the camera and held my hand over the hole. In the viewer, I could clearly see a pair of dark golden eyes glowing in the darkness of that hole. I was just about to cry out to Galen when I heard her shout, "Mike, get up here quick!" She was at the back of the house, in what looked like the kitchen. Off to the side was another leaf and debris-covered room with a hatch door in the middle. It looked to be a door to a root cellar, so we made our way to the door. It reeked with a stench of death in the room, and it got stronger the closer we got to that doorway. There was what looked to be blood leading up and down the steps. Galen goes, "Look." At the bottom of the steps was a carcass of a huge deer lying partially in the dim light of the small amount of sun that made its way in and partially in the darkness of the root cellar. I was kind of relieved and thought to myself, that explains the blood and stench of death. I was just beginning to tell her I'm not going down there when the carcass suddenly was dragged out of the light into the darkness. One of us screamed, and I'm pretty sure it was me. Galen didn't have to yell run this time. We both bolted out of the room toward the front door. I let her go first, out the front door, down the steps, and into the brush. If we were to be eaten, best it was me first, but I had the keys to the truck. The things you think of when you are about to be eaten, right? I got 20 feet into the brush and looked back, and what I saw shook me to the core. In the darkness of the doorway, I saw red eyes glowing like brake lights of a semi-truck at night. I froze in my tracks. I was able to make out a dark shape in the darkness of the doorway. It looked to be a huge dog or a wolf, Bible black with huge pointed ears on the top of its head. It was then the eyes went into a malevolent squint, and then the thing smiled at me. I could see pure white teeth. The canines on either side and the front teeth were not rounded out like a dog's, but they were straight across. It had a flat, piggy snout, and I could see its nostrils flare as it lifted its head to get my scent. It then lowered its head and laser-eyed into mine, down into my soul, eyes glowing so red that I initially felt that it had me. That I was his for the taking. I couldn't move and dropped to my knees, hanging onto a tree. At this time, Galen yelled Mike with a hint of exasperation. That broke the hold it had on me, and I bolted, pressing the door lock remote on the key fob so Galen could get into the truck. I got in, fired the ignition, dropped it into gear, and spurred a rooster tail of dirt and gravel 20 feet into the air. "What was that?" Galen said. I replied, "I don't know. Not sure myself what I had just seen." "Maybe it was a bobcat," Galen replies. "Yeah, you're probably right," I said, relieved in the fact that she had not seen what I just had, that she had not looked into the eyes of the devil, that he didn't know who she was. and that she was not on his list. That's what I somehow felt as true. As we were driving away, Galen says, "Do you think we could go back sometime to get that TV for me, baby?" I looked in the rearview mirror at the house fading in the distance with vultures flying about wondering what happened to their meal and said, "We'll see," knowing full well I was never going back there, not even travel on that road again. That was in the fall of 2016. Galen has moved an hour and a half away due to life. We didn't get out too often. But all throughout the winter of 2016 into 17, my experience was in the back of my mind. Would it hunt me down? Was he scoping me out, waiting for the right time to take me? I live in a single-wide trailer next to a lake with my two rescue cats, Little Boy and Adam. I let them out at daybreak and bring them in at night. Little Boy likes to get on the roof, as do a family of raccoons. Sometimes at night, the raccoons will run across my roof, freaking me out. I hope it's raccoons anyway. There have been a couple times that I've smelled that stench. It's the country and things die out in the woods, but I don't go off my back porch at night. Later in the spring of 2017, maybe late May, I was driving on a country road, Graves Bridge Road, along the Pig River. It's a gravel road, and I decided to park and get out and look at the fish sunning themselves in a primeval-looking shallows of a swampy S-curves of the Pig. It was then that I thought I heard a baby cry. I heard it again. It sounded like a demonic baby cry, but I had to check it out. I have to admit I was scared. When I made my way to the sound, I drew my pistol. It's a Taurus Judge. It shoots either 5.45 caliber Colt cartridges or 410. I usually keep it loaded with 4 shots and 1 bullet. I made my way through the scrub, and what I saw was heartbreaking. It was a dead mountain lion with its cub lying beside her body. I walked over to the scrawny cub. It growled at me pitifully and tried to run, but it collapsed after only a few feet. The mother was ripped to shreds. Whatever had done this to them, she had fought mightily. About 10 feet over was even a sadder sight. It was another cub with its midsection completely eaten out to the spine. I assumed this was the brother to what I later found out would be his sister cub. She was missing an ear. Her eye was closed and covered in dry blood. I went to the back of my truck and got a Dollar General basket and a jean jacket I had in the back. I put my arms into the jacket and used it to lift her and put her into the basket, and she didn't fight, resigned to her fate. I kept telling her, you'll be fine, baby girl." When I brought her home, my cats freaked out. Adam went running to the back, but Little Boy was right there, curious as usual. She was bigger than them, but she was in such a bad way that she was no threat. I got a warm, wet cloth and cleaned her eye. It opened. She hadn't lost it, but she did lose her ear. She had 4 horizontal gashes on either side of her flanks. They weren't too deep and had scabbed up. I had some cat antibiotics, so I filled a syringe and squirted some into her mouth. The weird part was that she never fought me. I found that odd. I fixed up some warm milk and filled the syringe, and she drank that eagerly. I fixed up a box with some towels and put her in the back room. Little Boy, who has more empathy than most people, insisted on staying right next to that box. Adam could give a crap. I ended up cutting out one side of the box so she could come and go. Little Boy would curl up with her. I went ahead and named her Jet because the gashes had healed, but the scars made her look aerodynamic and fast. She soon started eating Fancy Feast by the box. I ended up getting Alpo dog food, and she ate that heartily. I knew I should have called animal control, but I was afraid they were going to put her down with the shape she was in. After about a week, she was up and about, Little Boy by her side. It was as if she had adopted him as her own brother. They would roll and play fight, and I could even pet her, but there was a look in her eyes, a lack of joy, as if she was on a mission. I wish I could say that she became my pet. that we were a family, but after 4 weeks, she was playing with little boy in the front yard and she just disappeared. I knew it was inevitable, that she would leave. She had a mission of revenge. Somehow I knew this. Fast forward the summer of 2019, I had almost completely forgotten about Jet and the wolf creature. That's when I had reconciled in my mind with what that red-eyed devil had been. It was out one day riding around looking for the Nazi house, a house that Galen and I had found with swastikas painted all over the walls, very foreboding house. Anyway, I saw an old farmhouse about 100 yards off the road with a pasture. I parked the truck and made the trek through the tall grass to the farmhouse. Typical abandoned farmhouse for this area, with the barn towards the back of the property next to the tree line. The house was filled with dust and trash, no artifacts of note to be seen. The barn was further back with a pond next to it, so I decided to check it out. I walked up to it and through the door when I saw it. It was that wolf creature. It was crouched down with its haunches on a small deer. In its hands. It had hands with elongated fingers with claws at the end. It was feasting on a poor baby deer like a man would eat an ear of corn. Then it stood up and smiled at me. It must have been 7 feet tall. It was holding this deer in one hand like a basketball. I say this because the beast looked like a basketball player, thin at the waist with a large developed chest. It was a male because I could see its junk. The legs weren't like a man, but like a dog's, only longer. I knew it was a Dogman at this point. I grabbed my pistol and turned to run simultaneously. I could hear it take off behind me. I had a 30-foot head start, but I knew I had no time. I started firing behind me. I heard it yelp when a slug had hit it, but I knew a 410 shot was only going to upset it. I fired the last shot just as I reached the front side of the house. I knew I was a goner when I saw a flash of movement to my left off the front porch. I heard an incredible collision of sound and growling. I turned and fell back. It was Jet. That one-eared bitch had jumped on its back and had a death bite on the back of its neck. I could see her powerful muscles bulging and heaving as she dug into that thing. It turned its head and tried to get Jet, and she adjusted her bite to grab the front of its neck. It roared with a strangled howl. She glanced at me. The look on her face was pure revenge. I knew she was getting even for her mother and brother. "Get that MFer, Jet," I yelled. Suddenly the Dogman was able to grab Jet's left paw with its mouth. She lost her grip on its neck. I took this as a sign to me to get out of there and took off for my truck. I heard the battle just echoing through the small valley. I got to my truck and turned just in time to see the Dogman running back around the barn into the tree line. Jet limped on 3 legs back to the open porch. I could see her breathing mightily as she was licking her paw. She looked up at me just for a moment and then to her left. She jumped onto the porch and ran as fast as she could to the edge of the woods. I was curious as what she was doing, and then I saw why. She had 2 cubs waiting in the tall grass. The 3 of them started to love each other. She gave me one more glance, then dissolved into the darkness of the tree line like ghosts in the woods. My heart leapt with emotion. I knew the battle wasn't over, though. Out there in the deep woods, there's a hidden war going on. If you're ever in the woods and come across the stench of death, turn and walk away. I count my lucky stars. I have looked into the eyes of pure evil and survived. I showed love and mercy to one of my fellow creatures of God, and it was returned to me tenfold. I feel I learned this from little boy. Adam could still give a crap, though. So the first time I narrated this experience, I had a smile from ear to ear. I'm a cat person. I have a Maine Coon cat. And I've always thought how lions and tigers are the apex predator of their domain and pretty much over the animal kingdom. until I saw a Dogman in 1994. And then I was like, wow, that thing is huge. But just to hear this story really brings the apex predator back to the natural world, doesn't it? Tonight's second encounter. This is not my experience, but instead one my grandmother told me about. One my aunt later corroborated independently, so I think they're pretty trustworthy. At the time, I'll note that there wasn't much talk of Dogman, as this was a decade before the infamous song had come out. Though there was talk of wolves or werewolves like monsters in Appalachia for a long time, so my aunt and grandmother just always called it the wolf thing or creature. For a little background, my grandparents, currently aunts, home is in the backwoods of western Grayson County, Virginia, which to this day is still sparsely populated outside of one or two large towns on the east side, and back then it was even less so, extremely thick forest with hilly terrain in all directions. You have to get on a dirt path and follow it for about a half a mile to get to a gravel-covered side road, then follow that for 30 minutes to reach a very small town just across the North Carolina border. If you go on a short way north, you'll find yourself at the Blue Ridge Mountains and Parkway that leads up into Appalachia proper. The forest is mostly low-lying shrubs up to about 4 feet, with pine and high black oak trees making up the canopy. There is a very clear stream about 30 yards from the house, which has fish quite frequently. This, along with the wild blackberries, tender leaf shrubs, and some apple trees, make it a lucrative place for wildlife. The house itself is an old 2-story house, built onto an incline of a hill that it overlooks. This was back in the 1970s. My aunt believes it was 78, as she was finishing high school at the time. My dad had just graduated from college and was going into the Air Force, so he had already moved out. My granddad, although he was old enough to retire, liked to remain busy, so he worked his old job as an electrician and power pole technician. Just now in an adversarial role because he was getting up there in age. He had just gotten the contract down in North Carolina, so he was away from the house for about a week and a half. This left only my 17-year-old aunt and my grandmother at the house. As I said, there was usually a lot of wildlife in the area. Typical morning for my grandmother was make breakfast, sit on the porch, watch the deer and rabbits eat at her shrubs. Sometimes she'd see or hear a bobcat, a fox, or a coyote. On one occasion, a mountain lion and her cubs strolled right past the house. I wonder if that was Jet. One animal she was familiar with in particular was a very large black bear who could be recognized by the folks around these parts from the white patch on his chest and the hole in his left ear. Grandma nicknamed him Captain because he had a habit of sitting on his haunches, reaching up with his paws to pick apples, a motion that looked like he was saluting. Captain was a very big black bear, but was not aggressive unless tested. He seemed to have an agreement with my grandparents that if they left him alone, he would leave them alone. He just strolled by the house every now and then to have some blackberries on the bushes or some apples that had fallen down, which meant he came by the house's yards often, as he was big to climb the trees much more, and the fruit trees around the house were low enough that he could just reach up and pick the food. My grandfather guesstimated he was somewhere between 500 to 600 pounds and roughly 6 feet tall, as Granddad once measured some scratch marks he had left on a tree. During the week, my grandmother noticed a fairly sharp decline in the animals nearby. It was the latter part of summer and the wet season, so most of the plants were in full bloom and the leaves were at their tenderest. Yet she couldn't see the hide nor hair of any rabbit or deer coming to graze. The coyotes she had been yapping every night for the past month had vanished. A few neighbors, by neighbors I mean people who lived within 5 miles, who stopped by told her something had taken their dog and their chicken coop had been smashed into. They assumed it was a mountain lion that was lurking about. It was the only other thing that could feasibly take down a large farm dog, as they had seen Captain, the only other predator nearby big enough to take down an 80-pound farm dog, the day after in a completely different area, gorging himself on a dead deer. They checked around and couldn't find anything. The next night, my grandmother was awoken by my aunt, who told her she had heard something bang against the outside wall. They checked around in the morning after and found one of the deer butchered, with a bloody smear on the wall. Judging from the way the gravel was disturbed, the deer had been walking by the house when something ambushed it, and in the struggle it got smacked against the wall. My grandmother, having grown up in these woods, was familiar with predator kills and methods. Mountain lions tend to jump on their back and rake their claws across the flanks to hold on as they bite the neck. Black bears will usually break the neck or back with their paws while biting the head. In the rare occasion coyotes attack a deer, they'll just do it biting down on the inside of their leg and twisting to rip the muscle and arteries. This kill clearly had the throat ripped out, but there were not claw marks to be found, and the bite looked narrower than what a cougar would be. Plus, she could gander there was only one predator from the way the ground was disturbed, which didn't make sense for coyotes, as they typically hunt in pairs, since just one alone isn't enough to bring down a full-grown deer. After disposing of the carcass, the next few nights were relatively uneventful, except for the fact that several times my aunt and grandmother would be awoken in the middle of the night by something that sounded like panting outside. Now, in these woods, you can hear a pin drop if it's close enough, and at some points they swear this animal was making the panting was directly outside the walls of the house. One day, grandmother was picking berries, and she noticed what looked like dog tracks of a very large hound going through the mud flat bordering the nearby stream. Thinking it may be the missing farm dog, who maybe just ran away, she followed the tracks until she heard something loudly growling at her from across the stream. She looked up to see a partially obscured face of what looked like a large, bulky, brown-colored coyote or wolf standing in the thicket on the opposite side of the stream. She quickly began to back away, glancing back only to check her footing on the slope that led down to the stream. When she looked back, she saw the very distinctive canine face in much greater detail because the animal had moved out of cover. But instead of stepping out of the leaves like she thought it did at first, she soon noticed that instead of standing up on its hind it was standing up on its hind legs and peering over the shrubs. Now, she had seen canines stand upright before. Dogs do it, foxes can do it, coyotes sometimes do it. It was the size that took her off her guard. She had been at that same exact thicket of shrubs just the other day, and her head only barely reached the top. My grandmother was only 5'3". This thing had its head pitched clear over the shrubs with a little bit of extra visibility. And usually when a predator is making no attempt to hide, it's usually because they're trying to intimidate. My grandmother managed to back away up to the hill without turning around, and when she started to get out of sight, the creature stepped out of the thicket on its hind legs. It strolled forward in a very uncanny way. She had trouble describing, but she insisted it never went back down onto all fours. Needless to say, she ran to the house in a backpedal sprint. That night, they heard the panting again, along with a distant howl and scraping sounds. They found the garage door, back door frame, and kitchen window frame all had claw marks on them from something investigating. The canine creature was seen a few more times across the week by my grandmother and the neighbors, usually on or near the area of my family's property. My aunt finally saw it when she saw a pair of fuzzy ears outside of her window. Now, she wasn't startled right off the bat from this, as Captain had come by her window a few times before, and she gradually lost some fear of the big bear over the years. But in his case, his ears just barely reached the edge of the windowsill. whereas in this case, you could clearly see them and the top of the owner's head. She quickly realized that this was not the bear because of the pointed shape, brown coloring, and the fact that it had two fully intact ears. They also started to detect a very pungent smell in the side porch. One time, finding what looked like a urinal or some other liquid stains on it, suggesting the animal scent marked it to claim its spot. It all came to a head on a Wednesday night when they heard howling in the distance growing closer. My grandmother flipped the porch light on and glimpsed the canine animal quickly sprinting across the lawn on its hind legs. Her sighting confirmed how big it was. She'd seen timber wolves at the zoo up to 150 pounds, and she was certain this was at least a bit more than twice that. For several hours of the night, they could hear it roaming around the property and pressing against doors like it was trying to find a way in. They glimpsed several points of shine of yellow eyes peering through the windows, as well as broad, long-fingered paws being pushed against the glass. This was the day and age before cell phones and 24-hour police service, so no one had means of immediately calling the police. Instead, my grandmother had to wait minutes on a dial line with difficulty trying to call the police station 2 towns over. She was distracted by my aunt screaming, running into the bedroom to get one of the guns out. She'd been sitting in the living room when she felt clicking against the glass and saw that the wolf thing pressing its face and baring its teeth against the surface with its claws fully outstretched. Both of them started to try and get the rifles and shotguns out. It was becoming increasingly clear that the creature was trying to get into the house and knew they were in there. They heard it panting through the wall before there was a sound of heavy footsteps and a very loud thump with a flash of fur on the edge of the window. They ran to the innermost room, the pantry locker, and stayed in there with their guns. Now it's not like in the movies when creatures roar, snarl, and hiss constantly no matter what they're doing. But they did hear a commotion outside. My aunt and grandmother hadn't the faintest idea what was going on and didn't investigate until morning. But they could tell something was antagonizing something, as occasional grunts, barks, and rumbles were audible through the blackness for about a minute and gradually moved off. They found no bodies, but there had clearly been an altercation. The ground was ripped up in multiple spots. The walls had dents in it, and there were some oxidized blood traces on the grass and dirt. My grandmother also found a trail where something had charged through the shrubs and recovered several vague dog prints as well as wider tracks moving the same direction. The animals all seemed to come back at the end of the week, and the howls stopped. When Granddad came back home, he, my aunt, and some neighbors surveyed the area to make sure they couldn't find the wolf creature. Evidently, the neighbors had also heard howls around their property at night and stopped recently too. They couldn't find it despite surveying the whole property, though they didn't find what looked like a track leading out of the property and running off into the mountains. Several days later, my grandmother saw Captain again, making his territory by rubbing up against a tree in their yard, scratching the bark. He had several cuts across his muzzle, was missing patches of fur, and had some healed bite wounds on his arm. And the hole in his ear had been torn open to the point where he was missing half an ear flap. But other than that, and a slight limp that went away in time, he was fine. My aunt joked that he looked rather proud of himself. When he was told about the urinal-like smell on the doorstep when the wolf creature was running amok, my granddad speculated that it was trying to claim its territory. Usually black bears are relatively docile, but evidently Captain took issue with a newcomer imposing on his space and became aggressive. So what grandmother and aunt had heard that night, the bear was charging while it was distracted and engaging the intruder. While the wolf-looking creature was taller, it seemed skinnier and less massive, and apparently in a confrontation and threat displays that likely followed, sheer bulk won out. Apparently, it decided it wasn't worth claiming this spot if it meant having to square off with a quarter ton of claws and teeth. Captain had run the intruder off to protect his territory and coincidentally help my family. As a thank you, and so he could recover his strength quicker, my grandmother trimmed the apple trees, down all the fruit, and let the bear just enjoy himself without feeding him directly. Don't want to associate with humans. Winter would be in a few months, and she wanted him fattened so he could stick around for the next year, just in case. As she put it, the forest will always have a boss, and it's better to have one who is not interested in eating you. Decades have gone by, and while both my grandparents and Captain have passed, the Dogman creature never returned. There's been about 3 black bear who moved into Captain's place since, and each has grown about as big as he was. Thankfully, that seems to have been enough to ward off any other creatures. And right there, my friends, is 2 experiences where the Dogman, the apex predator, is, well, taken second best, I guess, huh? Anyway, I hope you guys liked today's upload as much as I enjoyed sharing it with you. May the Great Spirit watch over us all, and may He guide us down that path that we call life.